In 1986, 16-year-old Deanna Ogg was murdered in Texas. For 40 years, no one stood trial. Then, this spring,
Bobby Charles Taylor sits in jail tonight, charged with the murder of Deanna Ogg.
An arrest 4 decades later lands hard. By then, most people had stopped waiting for an answer.
what finally named a suspect was DNA, a match the Montgomery County Sheriff could barely put into words.
I'm told that the level of confidence is 1 in an octillion. That's an insane number, 3 times as many people there are in this world.
A number that size stops being a statistic. It points at one single person.
At that same press conference, the sheriff read a few words Deanna's mother had written.
I wasn't on this earth for a long time. She was here for a good time.
A Montgomery County courtroom, April 26, 1990. A jury foreman stands and reads a number into the record, 99 years. The man it lands on, a logger named Roy Criner, does not move. The room goes quiet, and here is the part that quiet does not tell you. The DNA said no. 7 years after that sentence, a forensic test would prove that the biological evidence taken from the victim did not come from the man the state of Texas had just locked away. And the highest criminal court in that state would look at that result and decide it didn't matter. They kept him in prison anyway. Whoever actually killed Deanna Ogg walked out of Montgomery County a free man the night that verdict came down, and he would not face a courtroom for another 40 years. If you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of case you're going to want to follow to the very end. Start where it should have started, with the girl. Deanna Ogg was 16 years old. According to ABC 13 Houston, she was a student at New Caney High School, living with her family in Porter, a small community in Montgomery County, north of Houston. She liked music. She liked clothes. She was, by every account her family later gave, an ordinary teenager in an ordinary Texas town. On the afternoon of September 27, 1986, around 5 o'clock, Deanna left her home on foot. Click 2 Houston reports she was walking roughly 2 miles down toward a convenience store at the corner of FM 1314 and Sauters Road. She needed a ride. There was a family gathering, and the store was where she could find someone to take her. She made it to the store. She was seen there alive. That is the last confirmed sighting of Deanna Ogg. She never reached the gathering. She never came home. About 2 hours later, according to Click 2 Houston and ABC 13, children playing in a heavily wooded area off a logging road found her body. The location was the 17000 block of Old Houston Road, roughly 7 miles from the store where she was last seen. A 16-year-old who had set out to catch a ride was now 7 miles in the wrong direction, in the trees, off a road that mostly logging trucks used. The medical examiner's findings were severe. According to Click 2 Houston and KWTX, Deanna had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed with blunt force trauma to the head. That is the clinical record, stated once. What matters for everything that follows is one fact buried inside it. Whoever did this left biological evidence behind. DNA, collected at the scene in 1986 when the technology to read it barely existed.
A girl who left home to catch a ride to a family gathering should have been back by dark. Instead, she ended up miles from anywhere she meant to be. The distance alone tells you she did not walk into those woods on her own.
That evidence would outlast the investigators who collected it. It would outlast a wrongful conviction, a pardon from a sitting governor, and 4 decades of silence. It is the only honest witness in this entire case, and it would take 40 years for anyone to finally listen to what it had been saying the whole time.
One thing in that record could not be argued with, coached, or misremembered. Biological evidence does not change its story over time. Everything human in this case would fail. That single piece of physical material was the one thing that would hold.
Deanna Ogg was buried in Montgomery County. She never left it. The man who put her there did. The arrest came fast, maybe too fast. About a month after the murder, investigators had a name: Roy Wayne Criner, 21 years old, a logger living near Porter. And the case against him did not come from the crime scene. It did not come from a fingerprint or a witness who saw him with Deanna or anything physical at all. It came from 3 men talking. According to the Innocence Project, 3 of Criner's acquaintances, Michael Ringo, Terry Dale Hooker, and Jeffrey Pitts, told investigators that Criner had bragged to them. The story they relayed was that Criner had picked up a female hitchhiker, threatened her with a screwdriver, and forced her to have sex. That was it. That was the case. 3 secondhand accounts of something a man supposedly said.
3 secondhand stories are about the weakest thing a prosecutor can carry into a courtroom. No one in that group saw the crime. Each man was only repeating what he claimed a 4th man had said. A story about a story, with nothing underneath it to test.
Evidence like that should make a case harder to bring, not easier. A man's freedom hung on words passed mouth to mouth, with no recording and no document behind them. That is not proof. That is a rumor wearing a suit to court.
Think about what that kind of evidence actually is. It is not a witness who saw the crime. It is not a victim's identification. It is a story about a story. 3 people each repeating what they claim a 4th person told them, with no recording, no document, no way to test a single word of it against reality. In legal terms, it is among the weakest material a prosecutor can take to a jury. And in this case, it was not the weakest part of the state's evidence, it was all of it. There was no DNA match. There was no confession to police. There was no physical link tying Roy Criner to Deanna Ogg, to that wooded road, or to that afternoon. There were 3 guys repeating a story and a logger with no alibi strong enough to make the story go away. Even the prosecution seemed to know how thin it was. Court records show the murder charge against Criner was dropped before the case ever reached trial. He was tried only for one thing: aggravated sexual assault. On April 26, 1990, before District Judge John the 100th Martin in Montgomery County, a jury convicted Roy Criner. The sentence, per the Innocence Project and the National Registry of Exonerations, was 99 years. Now look at what the jury was asked to believe and what it chose to overlook. According to the Innocence Project and the National Registry of Exonerations, all 3 witnesses described the girl in Criner's alleged story the same way, as about 20 years old and drunk. Deanna Ogg was 16. Her toxicology showed no alcohol, no drugs, nothing. The victim in the witness's story and the victim on the medical examiner's table were not the same person on paper, and the timeline did not fit either. 2 of the 3 indicated that the encounter Criner described had happened the night before the murder, not the night of it.
The description and the dead girl do not line up on any axis that matters. Wrong age, wrong condition, wrong night. 3 separate points where the story and the body refuse to meet. When the only evidence you have contradicts the victim it is supposed to describe, that is not a thin case. It is a different case entirely.
So the account that convicted him described a woman who was the wrong age, in the wrong condition, on the wrong night. 3 points of contradiction in the only evidence that existed. The defense, led by attorney Mike Charlton, would later build years of appeals on exactly these gaps. But in that courtroom, in the spring of 1990, none of it landed. The jury convicted anyway.
99 years came back on stories that did not even match the girl who was killed. That is not a verdict the strength of the evidence earned. A town wanted a name to blame, and the name on offer was the one that paid for it.
That is the kind of detail that is easy to skim past, so slow down on it. A jury was handed 3 second-hand stories that did not match the dead girl in front of them, and they returned 99 years, not because the evidence was strong, because in 1986, in a small Texas county, a brutalized teenager demanded a name, and Roy Criner's was the one that had been offered. That is the face of a logger from New Caney, Texas, who was about to spend the next 10 years of his life in a state prison for a crime the physical evidence had not yet been allowed to speak on. When it finally did, it would say one word, and the people with the power to act on it would spend years explaining why that word didn't count. For 7 years, Roy Criner was just another inmate with a long sentence and a thin file. Then the science caught up. By 1997, DNA testing had matured into something a courtroom could trust, and Criner's case had the one thing that makes DNA testing possible: biological evidence, preserved from the scene. In June 1997, according to the Innocence Project, the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office agreed to submit the sexual assault kit evidence for testing. In August, the results came back. The semen recovered from Deanna Ogg did not come from Roy Criner. He was excluded, not inconclusive, not can't be sure, excluded.
An exclusion is a specific kind of result. It is not a soft maybe, and it is not a gap in the data. It is the test answering the one question it was asked, and answering it cleanly.
The district attorney did not take that lying down. Court records show the office ran a second, confirmatory test at the state lab. Same evidence, fresh analysis, same result. Roy Criner was not the source. Twice over.
2 tests, run separately, landing on the same answer. That is the system being handed a chance to make something right, and the state spending that chance trying to prove the result wrong instead.
A habeas corpus petition was filed, and in January 1998, the case reached a Montgomery County District Judge named Michael Mays. According to the Innocence Project, Judge Mays reviewed the DNA, accepted what it showed, and recommended granting Criner a new trial. The judge closest to the evidence looked at it and said, "This man deserves another day in court."
The judge nearest the record is usually the one who has read it most carefully. A recommendation from that seat carries the weight of someone who sat with the evidence, not someone reading a summary from a distance.
Then it went up to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the highest criminal court in the state. And in May 1998, the Court of Criminal Appeals overruled the trial judge. Read how they did it, because this is the spine of the whole case. According to the Innocence Project and Northwestern law, the appeals court argued that the DNA exclusion did not establish innocence. Maybe, the court reasoned, Criner had worn a condom. Maybe he hadn't ejaculated. And in language that would follow that court for decades, Judge Sharon Keller suggested the semen could have come from consensual sex the victim had before she was killed. None of those theories had been raised at trial. There was no evidence for any of them. No condom, no second man, no account of consensual sex. The court did not find these things. The court imagined them, at the appellate stage years later, for the express purpose of keeping a conviction alive after the physical evidence had directly contradicted it.
Look at the order of operations there. The conclusion came first. The man stays in prison, and the reasoning was reverse-engineered to fit it. A court is supposed to read the evidence and arrive at a result. This was a result that went looking for evidence to justify it.
There is something backward about a room full of people inventing reasons a thing might be innocent when the test in front of them just said it wasn't his. The whole point of a test is to stop the guessing. They used it to start more.
I'm not telling you the appeals court broke a law. They had the authority to do what they did. The question is whether they should have. The man who ran the original investigation would, decades later sum up this exact stretch of the case in plain terms. Listen to how the Montgomery County Sheriff described what happened once the DNA came in.
The DNA exonerated the former person that was arrested for the case. At that time, it stalled a little.
A little. That is how it gets described now, with the comfort of hindsight. From inside a prison cell, it was 10 years, and the thing that finally cracked it open was something even smaller than a court ruling. It was a cigarette. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals invented a theory to keep Roy Criner in prison. Subscribe, because what was found on a single Marlboro cigarette filter is the thing that court chose not to reckon with. There was one more piece of evidence at that crime scene that nobody had finished with. A Marlboro cigarette filter recovered from the woods near Deanna's body. Post-conviction, it was tested. Both the Innocence Project and Northwestern Laws Clinic recount what it showed. The filter carried male DNA. Roy Criner was excluded from it. He was not the smoker. But the result did something the kit alone could not. The male DNA on that cigarette filter matched the male DNA from that kit. Follow the logic of that, because it is airtight. The same unknown man's DNA was in 2 separate places at the scene, on the evidence taken from Deanna's body and on a cigarette dropped in the woods beside her. One man left both, and that man was not Roy Criner. This was no longer a question of whether Criner could be excluded. There was now a single, consistent profile of someone else, a real person who had stood in those woods, smoked a cigarette, and left 2 pieces of himself behind.
One profile in 2 separate locations at one scene is a different order of proof than a single sample. It removes the wiggle room. A stray result can be argued with. 2 results pointing at the same unknown person form a pattern, and a pattern is much harder to wave away.
Think about the human weight of that. A real man stood in those woods, lit a cigarette, and left himself behind twice over. That is not a legal abstraction. That is a person who was there, and the evidence had been quietly holding his shape the entire time.
And it cut directly through the appeals court's own theory. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had floated the idea that the semen might have come from consensual sex before the killing, some other man, unconnected to the murder. But the cigarette filter sat at the crime scene itself, in the woods where Deanna's body was found, not in some prior encounter. The same DNA in both places didn't describe a stray boyfriend. It described the killer. The very evidence the court had waved away as possibly innocent now pointed at one man who was anything but. The argument had moved out of the courtroom and into the public. In January 2000, PBS Frontline aired a documentary called The Case for Innocence, produced by Oprah Bickle. According to PBS, it put Roy Criner's case in front of a national audience. The wrongful conviction, the DNA, the appeals court's reasoning, all of it. Criner's aunt, Brenda Veron, would later credit that broadcast as the thing that finally moved the needle. And it moved. On August 14, 2000, the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, granted Roy Criner a full pardon. According to the Innocence Project and UPI, the governor's stated grounds were that credible new evidence raises substantial doubt about the guilt of Roy Criner. Substantial doubt, 3 years after 2 DNA tests had said the same thing in colder language. It took a national documentary and a sitting governor to make the state admit what its own lab had already proven.
A documentary and a governor's signature to confirm what a lab had already proven twice. That tells you the evidence was never the slow part. The slow part was getting people with power to act on it.
Roy Criner walked out after roughly 10 years. Texas later compensated him by the Innocence Project's accounting, corroborated by Northwestern Law's exoneration record, with a lump sum of $130,000 and a monthly annuity of $2,200 for the rest of his life. a check, and an apology written in legal language. That was the state's account settled with Roy Criner. But the other account, the one that mattered to a dead 16-year-old, was still wide open. There was a man's DNA at that scene, a real man. And in the year 2000, with all the spotlight and all the science, nobody could put a name to him.
A settlement closes one ledger and leaves the other untouched. The compensation answered what was owed to the wrong man. It did nothing to answer who the right one was, and that question stayed open with no machinery pointed at it.
Here is where the contradiction gets uncomfortable, because here is where everyone moved on. Roy Criner was pardoned. The wrongful conviction was famous now. Frontline, the Innocence Project, a governor's signature. The system had corrected itself and taken its bow. But correcting a wrong conviction is not the same as solving a murder. And the murder was no closer to solved on the day Criner walked free than it had been in 1986.
A system taking its bow for fixing its own mistake, while the person who did the harm was never once in the room. That is a strange thing to applaud. The relief everyone felt was real, but it was relief about the wrong man.
The man whose DNA sat on that cigarette filter and in that evidence kit had a name. He had a face. He was presumably living an ordinary life somewhere, going to work, paying bills, getting older. By the time of the pardon in 2000, he had already been free for 14 years. The attention had been entirely on the innocent man in the cell. Almost none of it had been on the guilty one who was never in it. And that is the strange shape this case took for 2 decades. A wrongful conviction is a story the system likes to tell about itself. The machinery aired, the machinery corrected, lessons were learned. It makes for a clean documentary and a clean headline. But underneath that tidy redemption story sat an unfinished one nobody wanted to look at. The girl was still dead. The killer was still out there. The same evidence that had freed Roy Criner had also, the whole time, been a perfect physical record of someone else, and that someone else got to benefit from the relief that everyone felt when the wrong man walked out. The system's mistake became its alibi. While the public absorbed the lesson of Criner's freedom, the man who actually did it simply kept living.
Notice the mechanism in that. A closed-looking case stops generating questions. Once the story had its tidy ending, there was no pressure left in the system to keep asking who the profile belonged to. The tidiness itself is what protected him.
Criner tried to rebuild. According to Texas Monthly's reporting on Texas exonerees, his life after release was hard. The magazine reported he was later arrested for making terroristic threats to a New Caney police officer and served 6 months in county jail. It's a fact, it's reported, and it's not the point. A decade in prison for something you didn't do does not leave a man whole. Then the story returns to where it actually lives. Because the real story after 2000 is a flat line. No name, no arrest, no movement. The DNA existed, the man existed. What didn't exist yet was the technology to connect the two. The profile on file in 2000 could exclude a suspect, but it couldn't go out and find one on its own. It just sat there in an evidence locker, a perfect description of a man nobody could identify. That is the loop this case hangs on. The answer was already collected, it was already in the building, it just couldn't be read yet. 15 years after the pardon, a federally funded program would set out to fix exactly that. Subscribe, because what they found when they finally tested this evidence again turns this case into something else entirely. Cold cases don't usually get colder than this one had. 40 years would eventually separate the crime from the answer. What closed that gap was not a tip, or a confession, or a deathbed letter. It was a federal program built for one job, reading DNA that older science couldn't. According to KWTX and Woodlands Online, In March 2020, the Texas Rangers Division flagged the Deanna Ogg case for the Texas Department of Public Safety's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, SAKI for short. It is a federally funded program aimed specifically at cold case sexually related homicides, the exact category this case fell into. A girl, a sexual assault kit, decades of nothing, and biological evidence still sitting in storage.
A program like that exists because cases like this one piled up for years. Someone finally decided that evidence sitting untouched in a locker was its own kind of injustice, and built the machinery to go back and look.
In 2021, according to Houston Public Media and Woodlands Online, the previously exhausted crime scene evidence was submitted to Bode Technology Group, a private forensic lab in Lawton, Virginia. And Bode does something that did not exist in any usable form in 1986 or even in 2000. They specialize in forensic genetic genealogy. Here is what that actually means, because the name makes it sound more abstract than it is. Traditional DNA testing answers a yes or no question. Does this sample match this suspect? It needs a suspect to start with. Forensic genetic genealogy flips that around. You take the unknown DNA and you run it not against a list of suspects, but against public genealogy databases, the same kind of family tree services ordinary people use to find cousins. The DNA won't usually match the killer directly, but it will match relatives, second cousins, a great aunt's grandchild. And from those matches, analysts build the family tree backward and inward, narrowing branch by branch until the tree points at one person.
Notice what the new method changed. The old test required a name before it could do anything. You had to suspect someone first. The new method starts with no name at all and works toward one. That reversal is the whole difference between a locked case and a solvable one.
It is the science that has solved dozens of cases everyone had given up on. The kind of cold cases that sat untouched for so long the original detectives had retired or died. What makes it work on a case like Deanna's is precisely the thing that made the case so frustrating for so long. The DNA was already collected, already preserved, already a complete profile of one specific man. Nothing new had to be found at the scene. The scene had given up its evidence in 1986. The science just had to grow until it could finally read it.
The answer was never missing. The answer was waiting on the rest of us to catch up to it. That is a hard thing to sit with, that a family's decades of not knowing came down to a lab method that hadn't been invented yet.
And when Bode ran that profile through the genealogy process, they did not just get a likely candidate, they did not get a list of maybes, they got a probability so steep that the case's own investigators struggled to put it into plain English at a press conference. Listen to how the Montgomery County Sheriff tried to describe the certainty of the match.
I'm told that the level of confidence is 1 in an octillion. That's an insane number, 3 times as many people there are in this world.
A number that big stops being a statistic and becomes a kind of verdict on its own. The science was no longer suggesting a man, it was naming one. The only thing left was to say the name out loud. By 2024, the family tree had a single name at the end of it. According to KWTX and ABC 13, Bode Technology's forensic genetic genealogy analysis identified the man whose DNA had been at that scene since 1986, Bobby Charles Taylor Sr. Look at the dates, because they are quietly devastating. According to Fox 26 Houston and ABC 13, Taylor was born around the 1st of October, 1965, which means on September 27, 1986, the day Deanna Ogg was murdered, he was 4 days short of his 21st birthday. He had grown up in the same area she did. He had been there the whole time.
4 days short of a birthday. That detail lands like a punch. A man who lived in the same place as that girl, breathed the same town air, and stayed close enough to touch the case for 40 years while everyone looked everywhere but at him.
And he had not exactly been keeping a low profile in the decades since. According to Fox News and ABC 13, Taylor had a prior criminal history, convictions including burglary, assault, and DWI. His arrest records ran from 1985 all the way to 2020. Roughly 7 separate arrest occasions on file, spread across 35 years. Look at them in a row, and you are looking at the years Roy Criner lost, the years Deanna's family waited, and the years a man with the answer in his blood kept walking in and out of the justice system on other charges, never once tested against the one case that mattered, because nobody knew to test him. His name was never in the running. He was a stranger to the file until a family tree drew a line straight to his door.
Consider the sheer ordinariness of how he stayed hidden. He was not clever. He was not underground. The system simply had no reason to point its question at him, and a question never asked is a question never answered, no matter how many times the man stood in front of it.
And that is the quiet horror underneath the genealogy breakthrough. Bobby Charles Taylor Sr. was not hiding in the shadows for 40 years. By the record, he was fingerprinted, booked, and photographed again and again across 3.5 decades. The system had his DNA-adjacent records, his face, his name, on file the entire time. What it did not have was a reason to connect any of that to a 16-year-old girl found in the woods in 1986, because it had already convicted someone else and then spent a decade defending that conviction even after the science said it was wrong. The wrongful conviction did not just cost Roy Criner 10 years. It told everyone the question was already answered, so nobody kept asking it.
A wrong answer does worse than put one innocent man in a cell. It closes the door on the real one. Every photograph they took of that man was a chance the system had, and walked right past because it believed it was already done.
When investigators finally went looking for Bobby Charles Taylor Sr. in 2024, they discovered 2 things at once. He was already a fugitive, wanted according to Texas DPS and Fox 26 on an unrelated felony charge, and he was no longer in Texas. He was believed to be across the border in Mexico.
A man already running from one charge had been running from this one for 40 years without knowing the science was finally close enough to catch him. The distance he kept didn't protect him. It just postponed the day someone said his name out loud.
He was 4 days from his 21st birthday when Deanna Ogg was killed. Subscribe, because the way he was finally tracked down is a story about what technology could do that 2 courtrooms refused to. A man can run for a long time, 40 years in this case, but genetic genealogy doesn't expire, and neither, it turned out, did the people working the file.
Time is usually a fugitive's best ally. Witnesses fade, evidence degrades, attention moves on. A genetic profile breaks that pattern. It does not weaken with the years, which means the math of running quietly inverts on the person doing it.
By 2024, his name was out of the family tree and onto a wanted list, but finding him meant reaching across an international border because Taylor, already a fugitive on an unrelated felony charge, was believed to be in Mexico. That turned a Montgomery County cold case into a coordinated operation. The Texas Rangers, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the FBI, working a 40-year-old murder across 2 countries. According to Texas DPS and Click to Houston, on April 24, 2026, Bobby Charles Taylor Sr. turned himself in to FBI special agents in Mexico City. The following day, April 25th, he was extradited back to Texas. On May 4, 2026, Click to Houston and ABC 13 report, he was formally charged with capital murder in the death of Deanna Ogg. and held at the Montgomery County Jail.
A turn-in is not the same as remorse, and it is not the same as an answer. But it does mean the man whose name had been missing from this file for 4 decades was finally standing inside the reach of a courtroom. That alone took longer than the girl in this case got to live, twice over.
40 years, and the file finally had a defendant in it. Not a second-hand story this time, not 3 acquaintances repeating a brag, a DNA profile, a family tree, and a probability so large it barely fit into a sentence. On May 6, 2026, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. According to ABC 13 and Woodlands Online, the room held Sheriff Wesley Doolittle, District Attorney Mike Hawley, representatives from the Texas Rangers and the FBI, and members of Deanna Ogg's family, people who had waited 4 decades for a reason to stand in that room.
A press conference is a procedural milestone, not a verdict. What made this one unusual is the gap it had to close. The official record finally catching up to a fact the physical evidence had been holding since the first year of the case.
When the district attorney stepped to the podium, he did not hedge. He stated the allegation as plainly as a prosecutor can. Here is Montgomery County DA Mike Hawley naming it.
We have alleged that this man, Mr. Taylor, has killed Deanna.
A sentence that should have been said in 1986. It took until 2026 to say it about the right man.
4 words from a prosecutor, and they carry 40 years of weight. The hard part isn't that it took this long to say. The hard part is that for a decade, the system was busy saying it about someone who didn't do it.
And then the sheriff did something a press conference rarely makes room for. According to ABC 13 and KHO, Deanna's mother had written a letter. She was there, but the sheriff read it for her, a mother's words about her daughter, delivered through a lawman's voice 40 years after the murder. Listen to the part he read about who Deanna actually was.
I wasn't on this earth for a long time. She was here for a good time.
40 years. That is what sat between a mother and that microphone. 40 birthdays that didn't happen. 40 years of a case file gathering dust while the wrong man's name carried the blame and the right man's name was never spoken. The cost of all that wrong reasoning was never abstract. It was a family waiting while the answer sat in an evidence locker the whole time.
A mother shouldn't have to send her words through a sheriff to be heard. That she did, 4 decades on, says everything about what the delay actually cost. Not a statistic, a family that kept a daughter alive in a sentence when the system couldn't keep her case moving.
So the contradiction finally closes, and the moment it does, it opens 3 more. The man charged has a family, and they are not silent. According to ABC 13 Houston, Taylor's daughters issued a public statement after his arrest. "Our family is living through fear and heartbreak," they said, "as we see someone we love deeply being portrayed in a way that does not reflect who he is." That is their account, and it belongs in this story exactly as they gave it. Bobby Charles Taylor Sr. has been charged, not convicted. The same justice system that was certain about Roy Criner for 10 years is now certain about someone else. The daughters are asking everyone to remember how that turned out the first time. Make of that what you will.
A daughter speaking up for a father is not evidence of anything except love, and it should not be held against her. The plea in that statement is not nothing. This case, more than most, has already shown what happens when everyone is sure and everyone is wrong.
The right question is what kind of certainty is on the table this time, because not all certainty is built the same way. One case rested on people repeating what they claim to have heard. The other rests on a physical profile placed at the scene by the science itself. Naming the difference is not the same as declaring a verdict. A charge is still only a charge until a jury tests it.
It is the fairest version of the question to ask, and this case more than most demands that it be asked. 10 years ago, the certainty was pointed at Roy Criner. and the certainty was wrong, so the daughter's plea is not nothing. The difference, the thing the evidence puts on the table now that it never could in 1990, is what kind of certainty we're talking about. Criner was convicted on 3 men repeating a story. Taylor was identified by a DNA profile found in 2 places at the scene, run through a forensic genealogy match. Those are not the same kind of evidence, but Taylor has not stood trial, and a jury has not heard a word of it tested. The presumption of innocence is exactly the protection Roy Criner should have had and didn't. On the other side of the same case, according to ABC 13, a relative of Deanna Ogg described the arrest as bringing the family a sense of peace after 40 years. 2 families on opposite ends of one DNA profile, both living with what it did to them.
Peace and heartbreak landing on the same day from the same arrest in 2 different homes. That is the shape grief takes when an answer arrives 40 years late. It doesn't undo anything. It just finally lets one side set the weight down.
As of June 2026, Bobby Charles Taylor Sr. awaits trial. According to KVIA and Fox 26, the capital murder charge carries a potential death penalty. No trial date has been announced. The account is settled enough to be charged and open enough that nothing is final. If you watched this entire case and still won't subscribe, drop a comment and tell me why. I genuinely want to know what it would take. And leave the real question where this case leaves it. In 1998, Judge Sharon Keller argued that the DNA did not prove Roy Criner's innocence. She was right in the narrowest possible way. The DNA only proved he wasn't the source. But in 2024, that same DNA did the thing she never accounted for. It didn't just clear a man, it named one. So the question this case leaves open is not who killed Deanna Ogg. The DNA answered that. The question is how many years of wrong reasoning from a trial that convicted on 3 secondhand stories, from an appeals court that imagined a theory to keep an innocent man jailed, from a state that chose its conclusion before its evidence, stood between a 16-year-old girl and a true answer. The sheriff who finally closed the file put the principle in one line. He read it at that podium like it had always been true, even in the 40 years it wasn't.
We find suspects and we hold them accountable. It doesn't matter where they're at in this world.
It just took 40 years and an innocent man's decade to make it so.